It is the 24th of February 2022 while I'm recording this. A dark day in European history as the Putin regime in Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of a European nation-state. This is not a new war, it is actually an escalation of a war that has been going on for already 8 years. But the escalation we're seeing now is beyond what most people imagine. And I just want to take this moment to reflect on history, to reflect on war, and reflect on the possible outcomes of this. For people growing up in the 1990s, a European war is actually not something completely out of the ordinary. In fact, one of my first memories of any news event was the gruesome civil war in Yugoslavia. And that war went on for most of the 1990s in different phases. But it still has a very different nature than the current war in Ukraine, although there are also similarities, because they both have to do with the disintegration of larger federal socialist states. The difference being that in Yugoslavia, the war happened as soon as the state fell apart, and we also had several different wars in the former Soviet Union as it was falling apart. We had two conflicts in Georgia, you had Chechnya, you had Karabakh, you had Transnistria, but in Ukraine itself, no armed conflict happened in the 1990s. In fact, there was no history at all of armed resistance or even serious ethnic strife in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine is more the result of the actions of a single individual than it is truly a war among citizens of a country. And in that sense, you can compare it also to the Iraq war. There we also saw a fabricated pretext to attack a country, accompanied by a huge months-long information campaign, or shall I say disinformation campaign. If you compare the Ukraine war to the Iraq war, the propaganda that led to Iraq was probably 20, 30, or maybe 40 times more intense than the propaganda coming from the Kremlin before invading Ukraine. Before fully invading Ukraine. And I've always held the opinion that the Iraq war was not just the greatest invasion and war of aggression in my lifetime, but also the greatest lie. It was a huge psyop, a massive, massive psyop that ran globally to convince people that Iraq should be invaded and made a democracy. We don't know yet if Ukraine is going to have larger consequences for world history than Iraq, but we do know this is a war in Europe. It's a European capital where the people are currently fleeing from, where the air raid sirens rang in the middle of the night. It is a European war, and Europeans are involved. Some people from Ukraine might be listening to this, and most people I've seen online responding to this sympathize with them, and of course we do too, with the Ukrainian civilians, with the Ukrainian military, which is defending their homeland. There are of course also people who still do sympathize with Putin, who still stick to the based Putin meme, even people who identify as pro-European, who are now supporting the slaughter of Europeans, the destruction of a European nation state, and the negation of the nationhood of 45 million Europeans. And there's not really much I would like to say to these people. If you don't understand that this is wrong, then there's not much to discuss anymore. That's it. And I think it's also going to lead to a kind of political rearrangement, this tragedy. Because like I said, if you do not understand that this is a grotesque crime, then you're just lost. That's it. It's not about memes anymore. It's not about some stupid American culture war about the Republicans and the Democrats. It's about millions of Europeans who are now being attacked, who have rockets land next to their homes, tanks in their streets. Now, for the outcome of this, it is of course very hard to predict. But I do have to say that some defense analysts saw this coming weeks ahead, months ahead actually. But I would like to talk more now about the political implications. As some people have predicted already, and I do think there is merit in this prediction, is that this could be the beginning of the end of the Putin regime. War is risky business. A full and total war from multiple directions is even more risky. And we've already seen quite large demonstrations in multiple Russian cities. We had former generals already warning that Putin should not do this. And there were also mayors of several Russian cities who wrote a letter warning the Kremlin not to escalate this. Of course, Russia is militarily superior to Ukraine. That's a fact, and it's a fact that everybody knows. Therefore, the fall of the Ukrainian government is something we really should not exclude. In fact, it is quite likely. Once the Russians capture Kiev and install a new regime, we might eventually, and I know this might scare people, but it might eventually also lead to an actual Ukrainian civil war. Because some people will be just tired of the fighting, and they know they are not going to enter the EU or NATO anytime soon. That wasn't in the cards anyway because of the Donbas war. The EU and NATO are not going to bring in a new member where there's an active war with Russian soldiers going on. Therefore, some people might say, once the Russians install a new regime in Kiev, okay, let's go with it. Let's be a little bit more aligned with Russia, and then we won't have all this misery. We won't have bombs landing in our backyard anymore. While other people will certainly say liberty or death. They'll just go on fighting. And I know this is a really grim prediction, but I just don't want to exclude the possibility. It is a scenario that resembles somewhat the early independence struggle in Ireland, where after long years of fighting, a kind of autonomous regime was installed that still was loyal to London, while other Irishmen continued to fight for full independence and thus started fighting with the new regime. Of course, this war will also have great consequences for our economy, for our energy, and for our defense policy. Many people have also claimed, and some have claimed it in celebration, that European strategic autonomy has been the first victim of this war. It's a sad and tragic conclusion, but a conclusion that, at the moment, at least, seems correct. But we also know that America cannot forever take care of Europeans' security. And that's why we've also been firmly on the side of Emmanuel Macron, who at least tried to pick a European path and a European diplomatic strategy. And in fact, until the last moment, he tried through diplomacy to prevent this conflict. The efforts were in vain, but they were the right thing to do. And we surely hope and do predict that Macron and people like him will continue to support and expand European strategic autonomy, European independence, which sooner or later, and this is also partly wishful thinking but also partly just a prediction, will come into being. Nobody knows exactly how the tragedy in Ukraine will unfold, what will happen. Will we have a Belarus kind of regime installed in Kiev, or will we see a chain of events that eventually leads to a news report of tanks surrounding the Kremlin and Putin being deposed by the military? We shall see, of course, but one thing is certain, nobody lives forever, and the moment Putin is gone, there's a real window of opportunity to solve everything, every conflict in the eastern half of our continent. There will be a time to settle it all, to create new alliances, and in that case, once this regime from the Kremlin is gone, it will be an alliance between the European Union and all these three Eastern Slavic countries at the same time. Plus, of course, also Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia. And then perhaps, one day, it might take 50 years, it might take 100, we might see the entry of the entire eastern part of our continent, which has been left out of European integration, to unite into a European federation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Thank you for your attention. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to Europe.